So we're going to...
This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and we're going to start today's show in talking about some things that have been going on this week. But before we get started, remember that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. And in case you're like me, sometimes I just need a reminder of where we are. What day is it? It's December 6th, 2018. And if you're like me and a lover of history, regardless of the politics, hopefully you've been able to catch some of the funeral services for George H.W. Bush, who was our 41st president. And I started watching some of it yesterday, and I kind of got addicted to it. And one of the reasons for that, not necessarily because of the politics, because, on the show, we don't actually on WRUU at all, we don't really get into politics, whether somebody is, whether we consider one party be the right party or the wrong party. But what was interesting to me about it was the civility. It was also the humility in people talking about their what they learned from being friends with President 41 George H.W. Bush. And when I say the civility, it's people that were there that were not necessarily on the same side, but they were there to show their respects. And one of the things that has struck me of where we are in this country is that we seem to have lost some civility. And today especially also emphasized more humor. Yesterday was more formal, but today was more humor involved. And I thought that was very interesting for people to talk about humor and share some stories that made people actually laugh. And one of the recurring themes throughout was the service to others, and I think that's the other part. This is what's needed in order to get to the point where we can get to some healing in this country. And the show is entitled One Human Nation Show, and it focuses on the history and the impact of racism in this country. And we seem to have these ongoing problems that constantly come up that reminds me constantly that we still have to deal with reconciliation and healing in this country. And one of the things that was really, I think, touching about watching today's services for George H.W. Bush was the train motorcade. And he's only the 8th president in our history that wanted that as part of his final event, and so as far as part of his final services, that there would actually be a motorcade going through small towns that people normally would not have the opportunity to express their grief and just to show unity. And I thought it was very touching. And that's what healing is all about, is that we're giving the opportunity to heal. And that's something we haven't done in this country because, unfortunately, we don't want to face our brutal history. not only to African Americans that were enslaved, but to the indigenous people that were already here. And until we do that, we are not going to be able to move forward into becoming one human nation. My hope, because I always have kind of, I guess, a little Pollyanna point of view about things, is my hope that we can take this, what could be a tragic event, but what many people, conveyed that George Bush wanted to convey was that this was a celebration, that it wasn't supposed to be this down and out thing that, and of course people are grieving, and we, you would have to be a very unsympathetic person not to feel for family and friends that really had a very close relationship with him. And when you lose your parents, especially within a 12-month time period, I mean, anybody that's gone through that, losing one parent is bad enough, but losing both, no matter that they were both, I think, in their 90s, it doesn't matter. You're never prepared for it. So what I want us to do as a takeaway is to use this opportunity, or to use this event, whether you watch anything from it or not, or whether you consider yourself a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, to use this opportunity to take away, well, what can I use from this to help me in what I need to do in my little corner of the world? Because if you start looking at all of the things that you may consider wrong, or how do we get to this point, it can be overwhelming and exhausting and paralyzing, where you really don't get anything done. And so as I segue into talking about some of the unfortunate incidents that's still happening now, even with this historical event that's going on. And it's very interesting. I haven't really seen a lot of this on the media because a lot of it's been focused on the funeral and the motorcade. But that doesn't mean those things are not still happening. And so one of the raw topics, one of the real issues that this country is going to need to deal with is the impact of voter suppression. And, as many of you know, I live in Georgia now. It's where I was born and raised, in Savannah, Georgia. I love to be back here. And yes, we definitely have some issues that we need to continue to clean up in Georgia. But Georgia is not the only state. I don't know if you've been keeping up with what has happened in North Carolina in District 9. They are still, 4 weeks after the election, still not decided on declaring the winner, because there's I think I heard 904 votes difference in what happened in this particular area of North Carolina. And I don't remember the counties impacted by this. But there occurred this voter suppression that they refer to as harvesting, and that they had this group that supposedly did not have anything to do with the Republican Party that went door to door collecting absentee ballots, and so for a lot of people that were voting absentee, they're getting a knock on the door and somebody saying, hey, we're with whatever they said, we're just here to collect your absentee ballot, so you don't, whatever they told them. And so they have this gap in the number of votes that, people started calling in about their absentee ballot that seemed to have miraculously disappeared. And so as a country, we can't hold ourselves up, in my opinion, to be this democratic nation where there's fairness in the political process, not to mention the other systems that we have that are needing some major I would, for want of a better word, some major rehabilitation in order to get to even a semblance of having equity in our systems, like our prison systems and our public school systems and our medical systems. And, frankly, I can probably name 3 more. But again, this is about what do we need to focus on? And so the voter suppression issue is not only a Georgia issue or North Carolina issue or a Texas issue. I think Arizona was another state that had issues. It's all over the country. And in order for us to really, I think, evaluate why we have the problems that we have, is we have to go back in history. So by now you've kind of figured out I'm very much, I didn't know I was such a history buff until I started doing this show, right? I mean, I always was interested in history and seemed to lean in that direction. But once I really got involved with race reconciliation, which is what I got involved in really in Austin, Texas, is when my awakening moment. And it was horrifying because I grew up, even as an African American, I grew up at a time where I was told, get an education, you can be anything you want to be. And there wasn't the conversation of, it was to the effect of, yes, you're going to have to work harder because there are people that will hold the color of your skin against you. But it never really, I never really got the full impact of what that meant until I got to be very much in my adulthood. And so one of the things that we have to be aware of as human beings and as a part of one human nation and one human race is we have to take a look at some of our past that's not pretty. And so one of the things that I want us to take a look at, and we're going to actually talk about something that I think is a really huge first step for prison reform. We're going to talk about that. But before we get to that, we're going to need to take a little walk down memory lane and take a look at why we have such a divide in this country that really has its seeds in slavery. And I know you may be tired of hearing that, but I think repetition is a good thing in many cases. So let's take a listen to that.
When the United States gained independence and the Founding Fathers got together to write a constitution, it was pretty much assumed that slavery was naturally going to die out. Soon. Let me be clear, it wasn't because of any altruistic reason or movement towards equality, but because it simply wasn't profitable. That's right, even 200 years ago, all anyone cared about was their bottom line. But because it was dying out and because the US wanted to at least appear to be on the right side of history, they wrote into the Constitution that the importation of new slaves would only be allowed until 1808, at which point it was made illegal. Although that didn't really stop it either for reasons I'll get to later. Slavery was up to the states. They could decide whether to abolish it or allow it. And coincidentally, most of the northern states abolished it. Again, not because racism was over, but because it was simply more trouble than it was worth. Literally. So let's take a look at a map and see what the South was really worried about. The problem with looking at modern maps like this in order to explain slavery is that it isn't an accurate representation of what the US was going through. So let's take a look at what the US looked like in 1813. We had just started a war with Great Britain, had bought the Louisiana Territory a few years earlier, and had 18 states, 9
I'm going to pause that for a minute to let you know that I have posted that map on the One Human Nation Facebook page that he's referring to. And as you know, I pull a lot of these videos off of YouTube. So this particular one, if you're tracking that information, it's something that you can also find on the YouTube page. And I'm looking to see if I've got the specific title that you need to trace. And it's entitled on the YouTube page, Role of Slavery, Slavery Scar in the United States. But what I do is transpose these so we can listen to them on the radio show. But I just wanted to point that out to you. If you're not following the One Human Nation Facebook page, that's where you will see some visual of what he's referring to. But I think even without you being able to view that right currently, because I realize that some of you are not at a place that you can, if you're driving or doing something else, but please refer back to that, what's posted there, and you'll actually see the map that he's referring to.
9 free, shown in blue, and 9 slave, in red. At this point, there were just over 1 million slaves in the United States, and only 7 million people total, so about 16% of the population was slaves. And slavery had just become profitable. When the Constitution was written, slaves were really only used for one crop. And it's not the crop you're thinking of. It was tobacco and sugar in the Caribbean, but sugar doesn't grow so well in the United States, so just tobacco. The crop you were thinking of, cotton, was extremely unprofitable. This is what cotton looks like, and those seeds are not easy to take out. It took one slave an entire day to process 1 pound of cotton. To put that into perspective, a cotton shirt weighs half a pound, so one slave could make enough cotton to make 2 shirts a day. You obviously didn't have to pay them wages, but you did have to house and feed them, which was extremely difficult on only 2 shirts a day. So really, slavery was on its way out, at least until Eli Whitney's cotton gin, one of the most important inventions in human history, because it kept slavery alive. Now, instead of one slave making 1 pound, one slave could make 50 pounds. It's pretty easy to justify the cost of keeping slaves when their profitability increases 50 times over. From the time the cotton gin was invented until the Civil War, the amount of slaves in the United States quintupled, from just under 700,000 in 1790 to nearly 4 million in 1860. So even though the importation of slaves was banned in 1808, that law was passed before slavery was profitable. So even though a combined US and British naval task force gave it their best college try, the trade continued. Thanks, Eli Whitney. But let's go back to this map. Tobacco and cotton were the big products in the South and the main economic driver of slavery. You couldn't grow those in the North. You could really only grow corn and wheat, which you needed animal labor for, not human. So nobody really wanted to expand slavery northwards. But we did have all this fun new land to the west, which most people estimated would take several hundred years for America to expand into. As a wise man once said, if there's one thing that we're worse at than not murdering
each other, it's predicting the future.
Anyway, after the Lewis and Clark expedition, it was pretty much figured out that the land wasn't going to be very useful when it came to cash crops, but it was pretty useful in the fur department. By 1817, we had evened the teams up to 10 on 10 with Mississippi and Indiana, but fast forward to 1819. At this point, we had agreed to jointly occupy the Oregon country with the British, further leading to the genocide of the buffalo, beaver, and some people. We also permanently borrowed Florida from Spain, which wasn't very useful for cash crops either. We had added Alabama and Illinois, bringing us up to 22 states, but now we had a problem. It was becoming pretty obvious to the South that the space left for the US to expand into wasn't very useful for slavery. And while the House of Representatives is apportioned by population, the Senate makes every state equal. So at this point, there were 22 free state senators and 22 slave state senators. The Senate was what kept slavery at least legally safe, so they wanted to keep that equality. So in 1820, they struck a deal known as the Missouri Compromise, which legally mandated what the US had already sort of been doing.
Always two there are. No more, no less.
A free state and a slave state. The next two territories up to bat for statehood were Missouri and Maine, and no new slave states would be admitted above this line, 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. This is slavery's scar on the United States.
Roll credits.
Before we get too deep into the compromise, some of you with a keen eye might have noticed that Maine was already colored blue in the 1813 map. Was it already a state? Yes, but it was part of Massachusetts, which is why it's a major expansion in Fallout 4. But they wanted to break away and become their own state. How did they come up with the name for this state? Well, first you have to understand that very few people lived on Maine proper. They mostly lived on islands off the coast. And anyone who lives in or grew up in Hawaii can explain to you that when you live on an island, the rest of the country that's on the continent is known as the mainland. And that's how they came up with the name, Maine. Not very creative, but still interesting, right? So back to the map. In 1837, Arkansas and Michigan were added. Whatever. The real interesting addition to this map is Texas, which got its independence from Mexico in 1836. And while it really wanted to be part of the United States didn't want it, because of its recent divorce with Mexico. Anyone who's ever dated a recent divorcee can tell you that there's a lot of baggage, not least of which is trouble with the ex. But I've already talked about Texas enough in my previous videos, so I don't want to give them much more screen time. Not to to mention, you can't really grow anything in Texas. So while Texas did have slaves, they were mostly ranching country. Anyway, in 1846, Florida and Iowa were added, and then in 1848, Wisconsin and Texas was added. But wait, what happened to all that Texas territory that went up into Wyoming? Well, Texas was a slave state, and that was above the line. So they cut it off and gave it to what would become Oklahoma, which is why Oklahoma has a panhandle. There, are you happy now? I finally answered it. But we had also gained all of this new territory from Mexico that year. Unfortunately, it's not very good for growing any cash crops, or anything else for that matter. In fact, the US had pretty much statified all of its good cotton growing land. So in 1850, when California became a state, they ran into a new problem. They had thought about dividing California in two, California and Colorado, which I discussed in a previous video. But California didn't really want to be divided up. So instead they decided that California had to send one free and one slave senator.
Always two there are.
Which was difficult because there really wasn't that much slavery going on there. California is good farming land for fruits and vegetables, but not really anything that slavery would make profitable. But they went with it, at least until 1854. Kansas and Nebraska were up for statehood, but both of them were above the magic line. One was good for growing corn, the other for wheat. Again, not really suited for slavery crops. So they did away with the compromise and decided that the people in the state should decide whether they are free or not, an idea known as popular sovereignty. The problem with this, of course, was that suddenly Kansas was being flooded with people from other states, slave owners and abolitionists, hoping to sway the vote one way or another, which, if we're going to talk about the actual start of the Civil War, this is where the fighting began, in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. In 1860, Kansas decided to become a free state, and their constitution passed in the House but was stalled in the Senate over the issue of slavery. 4 months later, the Civil War started, which, by the way, is why Washington, D.C. looks like this and not like this. But this also happened to coincide with Lincoln taking office, and it's a commonly held belief that he is the reason why the Confederacy broke away. But Lincoln never campaigned for abolition and never said anything about wanting to free the slaves. It's kind of the 1860 version of people saying Obama wants to take away your guns. Lincoln wants to take your slaves, despite all evidence to the contrary. In fact, a year into the war, Lincoln wrote a letter saying, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." That last one, coincidentally, is what he ended up doing with the Emancipation Proclamation. It only freed the slaves in any area in active rebellion. So the slave states which were loyal to the Union, occupied Tennessee, and the Union-occupied areas of New Orleans and Virginia were able to keep their slaves. It wasn't until the war was ended and the 13th Amendment was passed that slavery ended completely. So was the Civil War about slavery? Yes, and to say otherwise is simply wrong. For the North, it was about preserving the Union and ending a rebellion. For the South, it was a last-ditch effort to keep slavery because it was becoming increasingly obvious that Western expansion was going to end it for them. The Civil War was not inevitable. That saying is part of the lost cause myth, which tries to explain it away as part of the growing pains of the United States. They were just acting out, you know, like a teenager. It was the end of slavery that was inevitable. So while even people like Robert E. Lee acknowledged that, actually, I'll let him speak for himself. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, physically, and socially. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their further instruction as a race, and will prepare them, I hope, for better things. How long their servitude may be necessary is known and ordered by a merciful providence. This influence, though slow, is sure. While we see the course of the final abolition of human slavery is still onward, and give it the aid of our prayers, let us leave the progress as well as the results in the hands of Him who chooses to work by slow influences, and with whom 1,000 years is but a single day. Although the abolitionist must know this, must know that he has neither the right nor the power of operating, except by moral means, that to benefit the slave he must not excite the angry feelings in the master. So to paraphrase, slavery will end eventually.
Now don't be hasty.
But it's not our place to end it before God wills it. Our thoughts and prayers are with them during this instructional transition. And also, in order to benefit the slave, one must not anger the master. Yeah, this one goes out to all the people who think Robert E. Lee was one of the good ones and didn't fight for slavery. So the next time someone tries to tell you that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, or that the Civil War was inevitable, hopefully now,
So, you may be wondering, well, what does that have to do with voter suppression as we're looking at it now with current trends? And you have to still know your history as far as what recently changed in the Voting Rights Act, which basically the federal government said the states, especially the states that have historically have had an issue, some of the southern states, specifically southern states, that's no longer a problem. So we don't really need to federally regulate those states anymore because we don't have that problem. Everybody is past that point. Well, that's not true. And so that's why we find ourselves where we are today. And so what we're going to do after a couple of announcements here, we're going to come back and very briefly touch base on some of the states and what they legislated for really to suppress voter registration in the vote, in direct votes one way, which it doesn't matter to me whether it's Republican, Democratic. The problem that people have now in this country is a lack of trust. I mean, that's what it really comes down to, because the mask has been peeled off and people are now like, wait a minute, I thought this, or I thought that, or I thought, and what they're finding is, well, that's not the way it is, because now politics is very much motivated by power and greed. And it's so expensive to run for any political office. It really does take a massive initiative of getting people out to vote in order to change those dynamics. So we're going to take a break here, just a few minutes break. If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we're going to kind of do a little quick wrap up on what we're talking about is voter suppression, because I do want to get to, I think, something that's very positive that's happening in prison reform, which is referred to as the First Step Act. And we'll talk more about that after we come back from some station breaks.
This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
WRUU 107.5 FM is a new and different listener-supported and all-volunteer community radio station for Savannah. Our diverse broadcast and web programming is supported by generous listeners who value our passion and our spunk. We're independent of other media and receive no government or large corporate support. People like you are the largest and most important source of our funding. So go to WRUU.org to find out how you can make a one-time or monthly contribution. Thank you.
The Savannah River Keeper presents the 9th annual Roast on the River, a benefit for the organization, the primary guardian of the Savannah River, providing education, advocacy, and action for the river's 10,000 square mile watershed. The event will take place at Hogan's Marina on Wilmington Island on January 19, 2019. For more information, visit savannahriverkeeper.org.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. So I do want to wrap up a couple of things in talking about voter suppression, and you can get more information by Googling this article that came out from the Brennan Center for Justice. Because one of the things when I started researching this to get the history of why is this all coming up now with voter suppression? You really have to look at the history, and it all really started after the 2010 election. So what happened after the 2010 election, there were new laws put in place that had a stricter requirement for photo ID. And again, you can find this if you Google Brennan Center for Justice, and that's the New York University School of Law, Brennan, Brennan Center for Justice. And so 2010, the 2010 election is what started triggering this. But, what happens? Out of sight, out of mind until it's time for elections again. And then all of a sudden, it's a whole different story. So what happened after the 2010 election? Overall, and this again is according to this article from the Brennan Center for Justice, overall 25 states had put in place new restrictions. And since then, 14 states have more restrictive voter ID laws in place. And then 6 states have strict photo ID requirements. 12 have laws making it harder for citizens to register. 7 cut back on early voting opportunities, and 3 made it harder to restore voting rights for people with past criminal convictions. Now, in 2016, 14 states had new voting restrictions in place for the first time in a presidential election. This is what's critical about this. Those 14 states were Alabama, Arizona, Indiana, Kansas, Mississippi, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Ohio, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And then in 2017, part of the legislatures in some of these other states, like Arkansas and North Dakota, passed voter ID bills, which governs in that particular state. And so in Georgia, as well as Ohio, Indiana, New Hampshire, there were also more restrictions enacted last year. So this would be like the beginning of 2017. So this didn't all happen overnight. And that's why it's so important that we pay attention and not get distracted, because we can't have a fair playing field if the rules are not fair for everyone. And it's abundantly clear that things have happened to make it where, unfortunately, as much as we may not like government regulations, there's something to be said when you can't regulate yourself, and that's unfortunate, but that is the harsh reality that we find ourselves in. And I believe that if we do not take the steps to correct this situation, we're going to continue to have a deterioration in distrust and the divide in this country. And my hope is in the generation that's coming up, that's just starting to vote and being active, that they can continue on their journey without really getting burned out and frustrated, because the more you know, the more you realize that things are definitely stacked on the side that has the most money, and that may or may not be aligned with how you think about things. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we change those dynamics? How do we keep moving forward on those initiatives that really, a step-by-step process, which is kind of a good segue to talk about the First Step Act, which will reform America's prisons to hopefully put a more fair system in place. So this is something that has happened relatively recent. I'm not going to mention names. You do your research and find out, we'll talk about in more details as far as what the intention is. But of course, I've heard negative things about this just because of which administration it was implemented under, which is the current administration. But it's appropriately named the First Step. So let's take a listen to that.
What's going on, America? This is B. Tatum again. Hey, I want to talk to you guys about what the president endorsed and the steps that he took forward in prison reform just yesterday. And I think it's invaluable to have this conversation. I think it's invaluable for us as Americans.
So I'm going to pause right here because I think to get a point of reference, I try to give the dates of when these videos were published, and I think this one was published in November of 2018. And again, you'll find more information once I post the recording of the show, as well as some additional information on the One Human Nation Facebook page. And again, remember that the viewpoints that are expressed from this particular person are not necessarily the viewpoints of myself as the host or WRUU, its listeners or supporters. But it's important because it's very difficult to find information that is truly impartial. We'll just, take a look at the news that we hear and now it's all about opinion. So this is a person's opinion. So you've got to put your filter on and kind of just absorb the essence of the message that he's talking about without letting a political hat come on. So let's continue.
Americans to really understand and identify exactly what happened. This was a big step for America. This was a huge step for reversing the effects of over incarceration in this country. Some people may not believe it. You can come up with your own solutions, but when you look at the numbers, we are over incarcerating people in this country. And I think the over incarceration doesn't necessarily deal in racism and all the other things that some people try to project, but it deals in the fact that we are arresting people, and not even just arresting people. We are sentencing people and having people in prison for things that they shouldn't be in prison for.
All I'm going to say about that is follow the money.
It's a waste of taxpayer dollars, and it's a waste and a deterrent in morality for our citizens moving forward. So the president, the First Step Act that he endorsed, made it through the House, bipartisan support. The next step is for it to make it past the Senate onto his desk, and then he'll sign it into law. So I think that like I said, it's a great step moving forward, but I want to talk to you guys a little bit about what this involves. Now, we heard the president read a script I don't know if he wrote it or somebody else wrote it, talking about a few principles that he believes is effective for making a difference. A huge thing is that this gives people rehabilitation and redemption. And if you're a Christian and you're a faith and you're a faith believer, then you understand the power in forgiveness. And I think that this act really gives the power back to the prisoners to have a level of forgiveness and redemption implemented in their lives as they return back to society. Because if we don't rehabilitate these people, or we don't give them opportunities when they get out, they're just gonna go back in. It's called recidivism. So that's a major thing that I think that the president has supported and will be implemented to make a difference. And then when you look at other things, and I'm gonna read it right off of the website, and you can look at it. I'll put the link to the actual act in the description section. But when you look at some of the details that are being articulated, it really makes a huge difference. So one thing I want to look at is the placement of prisoners closer to family. And I know it sounds very minor or something that's not very serious, but when you talk about the morale of a person that's been sentenced to prison, how can they communicate with their children, how they communicate with their family moving forward, that's an invaluable concept. The next thing is the home confinement for low risk. Giving people the ability to be in home confinement instead of in a prison system. And anybody that has been to prison, and I've never been to prison, but I know people that have been to prison. I got family members currently in prison, that the prison system isn't really conducive for people. You know, it's like animals in a cage. And
I'm going to pause this right here just to make sure that one of the things in researching the First Step Act is for me to let you know that this is referring to a specific population of federal prisoners. So I know, we can get things, like, well, what if they're there for murder or this, that, or the other? But this is specifically directed towards federal prisoners. So let's continue listening.
And to have the ability for low risk prisoners to be able to be in home confinement is a plus. Another thing I want to talk about is the rehabilitation, the identifying or identification for prisoners who are returning as citizens. That's a huge thing. It's the reincorporation of people back into society. De-escalation training. It's something that the president touched on is when they do go back, not only will it give them opportunities to be better and go back into the community, but they go back into the community with principles and things that they can utilize that can make them better people. They don't end up going to prison again. Because you don't go to prison for nothing. You go to prison for bad behavior. But when you get out, you don't want to continue to have that bad behavior. Also, evidence-based treatment for opioid and heroin abuse. Opioid is a crisis. Obviously, opioid, heroin, huge influx of heroin users, heroin victims, especially in the state of Arizona. And I know this is a national idea, but in the state of Arizona, heroin overdose, I saw it increase over the last 5 years I was in policing. I saw it increase tremendously, where they had to literally outfit the entire police department with Narcan, which is the chemical combination that you shoot it in somebody's nose and it literally brings them back from the dead if they're overdosing on heroin. So that is another really, really invaluable principle that's being implemented in this thing. Talk about healthcare, talk about rape elimination, different things like that. And rape elimination, you could be able to read it for yourself, but I think that those are all avenues in which we need to have these conversations. Now, let's talk about the history of this. And I want you to pay attention and listen to me really clearly. I want you to be able to focus on what I'm saying, because this is invaluable to our democracy moving forward. And this also goes in the political realm. Look at who was in office and who didn't do anything about prison reform, anything substantive.
So I'm going to pause right there because, I do have a personal bias when we start trying to make it seem like one party is better than the other party. I think I posted on my Facebook One Human Nation page that, and I'm a little bit cynical, no party is going to save you. So what we're going to do is take a listen to a more recent discussion about the First Step Act that really, I think this was published this month, December 3rd, and this actually is with the congressman that is also supporting this bipartisan bill that still has to go before the Senate, and I think they're trying to get it before the Senate before it closes out for the year, which may be a little bit of a challenge, but let's take a listen to that.
Bipartisan legislation focusing on prison reform is moving through Congress.
The First Step Act does a number of things, including curb mandatory minimum sentencing and focus on inmate reentry into society. I sat down with Georgia Congressman Doug Collins, who introduced the legislation in the House, about why it's so important. Congressman Collins, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
So the First Step Act deals with a lot of specifics within the criminal justice system. There are anti-recidivism programs that this addresses. It's obviously already passed in the House. The Senate could take this up. Why is this such an important bill? Let's just start at the 30,000-foot level.
Well, I think the biggest reason it's the most important, one of the more important bills is we talk about bills up here a lot of times, and we talk about it in terms of, what it will do here and sort of off obscure terms. This one is very real. This one has, as I've said before, has faces behind the lettering in the bill, because we're dealing with people who are currently incarcerated, people who want to have a second chance, they want to be a part of it, and we're also dealing with people every day who are going into the system. So when we look at people and the value that they have in life, we look at the chance for a second chance, a chance to come back into society after you've made your mistake and make a productive life. That's what makes this bill so important. And I think it makes it so important to the lives of families. And when you get it down to that base level, that's what we're here about.
Now, this is a largely bipartisan supported bill. You've obviously already gotten a tremendous amount of Democrats to vote for it in the House. And the belief is that you have a lot of Democratic senators vote alongside with Republicans to have this sail through. What are the objections to it so far?
The biggest objection is it doesn't go far enough. It's one of those issues of the what I call the extremes. It's not that the bill is not good. I've never really had a lot of folks come up and say that we don't like the bill, even when it went to the Senate and they've added a few things. It's more that they want it to do more. They wanted to do more sentencing reform, wanting it to do more of X. You just put that in there. So when you get to a point like that, you know you're on the right track, and what you have to do is you have to do what I call is the art of the possible. What is possible at this point? Hakeem Jeffries is my partner on this. We've had a lot of bills that we've done together, and Hakeem and I have, what we felt like we've done is sort of, spun that line right down the middle. We said, here's what we can get, here's what we can add to and still keep the coalition together, both Republicans and Democrats. And we've succeeded so far. And I think the issue at this point, Will, is getting Leader McConnell to put it on the floor, and we're going to see a good vote in the Senate, and it'll come back to us and see this to the president. Can't emphasize enough also the emphasis of the president and Jared Kushner and his staff in dealing with this. So I think that's helped us both ways.
Do you have any sense of what the timing is going to be from Senator McConnell to actually put this on the Senate floor and have a vote?
I'm hopeful in the next couple of weeks. That's they're still doing their whip counts now. They're working on that. It's got support, again, like I said, tying up the loose ends and adding in some of what the Senate, the way the legislation is actually done. We did our part in the House. Now they're doing their part. Hopefully in the next week or so we'll see that.
Senator Cotton has been a vocal critic of the First Step Act so far. Can you just address some of his specific concerns or problems with this?
Well, I think most of his concerns are addressed. He's just, Senator Cotton has just a different view of criminal justice. He has just a different view that if you've made a mistake, we're going to lock you up, and really is not a lot of concern on the recidivism side and not a lot of concern on what happens when they get out. I think when you take a short or version look or a short view look of criminal justice and it being in the punishment side only, you're missing the fact that 95% of these individuals will actually come back into the communities in which they're from, including Tom Cotton's home state of Arkansas. The question is do you want them to come back into that state simply criminals who laid in a bed for 3 years learning other things from other criminals, or do you want them to have the chance, if they choose so, to start out with saying, what got you here to start with? What are the things that we can do so that when you go back home that you're active, productive citizens? It's a philosophy issue that has been rooted in what has not worked. Frankly, some of the things that Senator Cotton is asking for, we've shown not to work. The 3 strikes and you're out, the throw away the keys, the longer sentences, we've shown it not to work in recidivism and other things. And we've also shown that when you actually work with prisoners, you actually do a scientific evidence-based approach, what the states have done, we have seen recidivism rates go down. That's a front-end savings not only in the prison system, but a back-end savings on when they come back into the community. So as I've always said, it's about money and morals. It's about the money aspect and the moral aspect of believing in people. That's where we're at.
Built into the name of the bill itself is the notion that there would probably be a second step, that there can be other things that come along. You mentioned the White House's support for this thus far and how critical that's been. We obviously have a Democrat-led House that will start in the new year. Do you believe that with support from the White House that there could be, after, assuming that this bill goes through, that Senator McConnell brings it forward, is there going to be a second step? Is there going to be something beyond this, and will Democrats come on board for it?
I think so. The question will not be necessarily on a second step at this point. The question is, will we get the first step done? Because I believe this first step is so crucial in the next 2 weeks to get done. I think Leader McConnell, if I had anything to say, would I say implore him to realize this is the step that gets us to anything else that we may want to do. Because it provides something to show that we can move forward in a large way and to do things that actually make a difference in the system when it doesn't destroy the system, it actually makes it better. So that gives us a background to say we've had a success here, then we can have another success. My concern is if we get it out of this Congress is that we'll go back to sort of more of our more partisan divides on saying, well, we can get more from a Democratic House than we could from a Republican House, and then we end up with a problem when it goes back, like say, to the Senate, and they have a numbers problem over there to get it voted on. So I think we've struck a good balance right now. This is not a bill that overreaches. It's not a bill that underreaches. It has found the proper spot, and now's the time.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and it's close to time for us to be wrapping up because the next show coming up is Troy Stoner with Sound Limits. And I just kind of want to do a quick little recap. If you want to find out more information about the First Step Act, which I would highly encourage you to do, is you can just Google it, and it'll come up. That's how I find a lot of my information. It's on Google and as well as what's on YouTube, although I take that more with a grain of salt because, again, YouTube is about people really expressing their opinions. So sometimes it's just better to read an article and make your own decision. So as a recap, the purpose of the First Step Act is to take steps to better prepare inmates from federal prisons for re-entry into society and to help reduce recidivism. In other words, going back into prison. And so I think any reasonable person would say that, there's got to be some merit in that, not only just from a socially conscious point of view, a moral point of view, but also from a revenue an expense point of view. But again, it goes back into looking at how do we have our prison systems now that are very much so privately owned, and it's a huge business. So this is a huge step that is going to require the folks in the Senate to make a commitment that the House has already made. And I am hoping that with the most recent event of this, the funeral for George H.W. Bush, that there's a spirit of working together, of doing the service and making decisions, even if you don't agree with it, if it's for the greater good. And that was something that resonated throughout some of the talks that were held at the funeral. And I thought that was very interesting because it speaks to getting back to having true stewards that are not impacted by the PAC dollars that they've received, which is a huge impact on how many decisions have been made in this country. It hasn't been made for the greater good of the country. It's been made for the greater good of the corporation that's funding you to do this and to vote a certain way, to put a certain policy in place. And now it's got us into this situation where we have more incarcerated people in this country than most other nations. And one of the statistics from when I Googled this and came up with this First Step Act information, it was kind of appalling. Today, this is from this article, today, 1 in 3 American adults has some type of criminal record, and more than 2 million Americans are in prisons, including 181,000 in federal prisons. So that is more than 95% of these prisoners will eventually leave prison, face the challenge of restarting and reintegrating their lives. And on the federal level, that's 38% on the federal level. That in the next 5 years are projected to be released, and 77%, roughly 77% on the state level. So I strongly advise you to kind of do your research, because as we go into 2009, I think we'll start seeing more of the, hopefully not as much, but some of the rhetoric to keep us distracted from what's truly important. So if you would like to send me information, you can do so at my store at OHNHumanNation.info. And really the key way to keep up to date on what's going on is to subscribe to one of the podcasts, whether it's through Podbean, whether it's through iTunes, or whether it's to the YouTube channel. And again, more information will be posted when I upload the recording from the show. And Troy's in the studio, so I'm going to transition out so he can transition in. Once again, thanks for listening to the One Human Nation show. Up next is Troy Stoner with Sound. Troy Stoner with Sound Limits. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of your week.